probably for about the same amount, maybe 10, 15 years. It's been a long time. He's a good friend and good colleague. We co-teach a summer field school. Hopefully we'll have it this summer. Let's keep our fingers crossed with COVID. We'll go back and work on another steam vessel, the city of Rockland. Calvin also, with another colleague, Laurel Seaborn, has started a not-for-profit, and I think Calvin can describe it better, but it's a concept of a learning concept that I found really intriguing when they came to talk to me, and found out immediately I became associated with it by my own choice. So Calvin, if you want to say a little bit about Cmap, that might be helpful.
Sure, and greetings everyone, thanks Vic. So Cmap stands for Seafaring Education and Maritime Archaeological and Heritage Program. It's really designed for the acronym, as all good acronyms should be. And the concept is a life cycle of the vessel. Basically, in developing this, it was trying to come up with a framework that people would understand quickly and readily. And Massachusetts was a perfect place to implement this. So you have the life cycle, the berth where the ship was being built, such as the Essex Shipbuilding Museum. Its life cycle of being sailing or steaming, and you have lots of tall ships all around that are available. And then the death would be the shipwrecking process and what happens there. So to complete that life cycle is the afterlife, the rebirth, and that's where archaeology comes in to show that it's part of this component. And in doing this, we take students, and as Vic mentioned, has worked at Salem State University on some field schools, and we take people with no experience whatsoever in archaeology or maritime archaeology for that matter, and in 5 days, put them through the paces, go out to an actual wreck, so there's hands-on experiential learning, and by Friday, they've created a site map, as well as some other educational products that can be then disseminated, as well as put into reports. And we've had a very successful run of doing that, and it's really kind of, people can get grasp it very quickly and understand how much endeavor and industry goes into understanding the role that ships and seafaring has played through time. It's much more than just the actual building materials of the vessel.
Well, thank you, Calvin, for that. The one thing I should have failed to mention, should have done right at the beginning, is I've known Calvin as a PhD student at East Carolina University, where he was also working as the staff archaeologist many years ago. And so he's got his PhD out of East Carolina University. Also has a background in the classics. So he's got a really well-rounded maritime background, as well as an appreciation for terrestrial sites. He's worked internationally, so it's not just working in the Carolinas or up here in Massachusetts. He's worked in Israel. Oh God, of course I blank every time. But anyway, Calvin is well-rounded. You're going to get a really good sense of the site that he is working on now. And I think it's for me, it's exciting because most people don't have an appreciation for these wrecks, but rather they think about them as a wrecking event, and that's the end of it. And I think Calvin can give you a much broader picture of how this vessel relates, as well as what's there. So with that, Calvin, take her away.
All right, well, thanks Vic again, and welcome everybody. So the first thing is that very tense moment when I share the screen and hope I don't lose everybody and you can see what I hope to see. As we've all been accustomed to Zoom, this is that moment. So let's see. And Lindsay, you've helped me out with this before. Remember to share sound, check all the boxes. I'm talking myself through this, so I actually do all this. All right. And you should see just a little diver kind of floating up there at the top of the surface. Thumbs up, right, Lindsay? I'm kind of looking at you as okay as we go through. PowerPoint.
Looking good on my end. So
okay, well, we're just pulling up the PowerPoint here, making sure I had the right one. And well, let's start from the beginning. It's always a good place to start from the beginning. See the slide okay? All right, so as Vic mentioned, I actually have a background. I taught Latin and Greek for a few years before hopping into archaeology. And the title has, right off the bat, has a Latin word that I'm going to explain at the end of the lecture here, or the presentation, but it's Resurgam, the Archaeology, Heritage, and Living Memory of the 1898 Shipwreck, Portland. So just to kind of give everybody an overview of tonight's presentation, I'm going to introduce our project that got me involved with the Portland, a little bit of background into the paddle steamer Portland for those. It's pretty well published. In fact, it has the nickname New England's Titanic. And so out of all the shipwrecks in Massachusetts and New England, this one has a fair amount of history written about it, and yet still so much unknown about this. And then getting into our 2019, 2020 expeditions, some of the exciting discoveries. I have some videos to show as we go through this. We'll actually take a journey inside the Portland for the first time outside of our project. I have some raw data to show everybody about going into the Portland. I'll explain how that happened. And then going beyond the actual shipwreck and talking about its contextual meaning as its ongoing heritage, as well as some of its living memory. I have involved with the project of interviewing descendants from some of the victims on board the Portland. So let's just get started. The project that I'm involved with was funded through a National Oceanic and Atmospheric National Ocean Service and the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries for 2 years, originally 3 years, but with budget cuts, they scaled back. And we wanted to go to Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary, which is about 800 square miles of protected bottomland in the middle of Massachusetts Bay. And if we think of the commerce and trade that has occurred over hundreds of years and thousands of years even before that, Stellwagen Bank really sits at the heart of the bay. Vessels coming in and out almost through this kind of world system of commerce and globalization. And so documented, there's over 200 wrecks. There could be more. It's still under investigation. But out of those 200, only 50 have been identified and only 12 has been really researched. So one of our goals, among many, was to do some further exploration and really help out the sanctuary. It was a collaboration between Woods Hole, or WHOI, and it was led by a biologist. This was a very interdisciplinary project. Her name is Dr. Kirsten Meyer Kaiser, and she's a research scientist at Woods Hole who has interest in shipwrecks as island-like habitats where colonization of larvae and various small organisms, and I'm just smiling right now because I know if she was out there, she'd be laughing, use shipwrecks kind of as islands. The shipwrecks aren't supposed to be there, and so they can be indicators, patterns of colonization. Myself as a chief archaeologist, a company called Marine Imaging Technology, which designed our underwater vehicles, our robots, remote operating vehicles called ROVs, and of course the staff at Stellwagen Bank Sanctuary. In addition, of course, we had external collaborators that came in when necessary. University of Rhode Island's Inner Space Center helped us with our public outreach component that I'll talk about. The University of Connecticut was nice enough to lend us their wonderful research vehicle, the RV Connecticut. And then we partnered with a really great program on YouTube called Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. And the gentleman who runs it partners schools with scientists through the National Geographic and really have provided us collaboration and access to schools that we otherwise wouldn't have. So our project for the 2 years was to really go out and revisit some known sites, particularly Portland, which I'll talk about as the premier iconic shipwreck of the sanctuary, as well as other shipwrecks, doing some ROV optical surveys that could be used, the raw data used for archaeological and biological analysis. And one of the reasons to do this was, again, management of, it's been about 10 years since any type of assessment had been done. And Stellwagen had kind of reached a point, they had lost their maritime archaeologists, good friends, Matt Lawrence and Dee Dee Marks, and they were looking for these partnerships. So it was a really good opportunity, especially as they're coming up in 2022 for their 30th anniversary, to go and look for new vessels, reassess the old ones that they had looked at, as well as bring new technology and see if we could add to the information they currently had. And so tonight's talk, and really the focus that the shipwreck that we focused on at the beginning is, as I mentioned, called the New England's Titanic. It's the paddle steamer Portland, which was built in 1889 in Bath, Maine. And for 9 years had a very unremarkable but a very important career as a night boat. A night boat was the ultimate of travel, luxurious travel between Portland and Boston, where you could get on at either of the either port and overnight be entertained and relax, and then the next morning arrive at your destination. And for $1, which is still a really good price, it's about $32, $33 in today's adjusted for inflation, still a really good deal. And you can see over here, put the cursor, kind of the network. Now, Portland itself was a massive vessel, almost a football field long, 291 feet total length, and then 40 feet wide at the beam, but with the, it was a side wheel steamer, meaning the paddles were on the side, and when you add those on, it was 60 feet wide. So you're looking at a football field long and about a football field wide. It was, as I mentioned, designed to be palatial. And we see a historic photograph on the upper left and a artistic drawing of the interior with one of the dome skylights inside. And in 2002, a model was made, a scaled model by Bluefield, which sits in Stellwagen Banks National Marine Sanctuary right down here. They really spared no expense. There was over 167 staterooms, cherry paneled with white pine berths. You could have all types of recreation, from a shave to dinner. And a colleague of mine named Herb Adams up in Portland, Maine, once had a wonderful opportunity to interview a passenger on board who actually was on board the Portland as a boy. Of course, he's passed away now. And this boy at the time was riding the Portland just 2 days before it sank in 1898. That's how recent and close this was. And Herb wrote an article where he quotes, and I'd like to take a second to just kind of give you a sense, a firsthand account, as it's mentioned, that here passengers could sip cooling drinks below a glass dome skylight and electric chandeliers. The interviewee states, "To my childish eyes, the very gangplank to this fairy place was promise. The grand staircases, the carpeted floors, the plush chairs, the forward saloon with gallery above, and the staterooms with those interesting bunks, one smaller over a larger beneath, and the people coming and going, all these experiences for a boy were foretastes of a sort of heaven." Can you imagine that child coming on board here, seeing things for the first time, and really having a wonderful experience that they would never forget for time. It's pretty magical. And it was designed to be that way. It was designed to remove you from the day-to-day world for just a little bit overnight and have that peace and calm as you traveled. Of course, that was destroyed on the evening of November 26th. In the upper left-hand corner is the captain of the Portland, Captain Hollis Blanchard. And at 7 p.m., he made a fateful decision to leave Boston. There had been weather reports through telegram of a storm coming up the coast. It was recommended that he wait until 9 p.m. when the latest weather report would come in before he left. However, while no one knows why he made the decision he did, the sky in Boston was overcast, slight wind, but nothing that indicated one of New England's famous perfect storms was barreling towards him. And there are conspiracies, there's always conspiracies, but in my estimation, I believe he made it a judgment, just like an airplane pilot would today, that he could beat out the storm. And so he left, but he was wrong. The low front met a second low front around New Jersey or around Virginia and picked up speed and overtook the vessel. No one knows the exact time in which it succumbed or met the storm, but there were reports of another vessel seeing Portland around 11 p.m. We think that they powered through and tried to fight the gale for the next 10 hours. And I'll come to for that reason in a little bit. But what I'd like to do right now, in 2003, the Discovery Channel made a documentary about the Portland in which they put together an animation of a possible sinking, and I'd like to show that right now if it plays. For the next 3 weeks, bodies and debris were washed up along the shore of Cape Cod. Headlines were confused. The fog of the moment of the tragedy led some to believe that their family members and loved ones had survived. Others had died. No one knew for sure. And even years later, even today, the exact number of how many perished on that is not known, because while they kept a list of passengers and crew, they only kept it on board the ship itself. There was no copy made in Boston to compare. And because of this tragedy, that practice was quickly changed, that both the ports leaving as well as the ship contained a manifest of those on board. So even today, the numbers change, and depending on the sources, you will see anywhere between, I've seen 190 to over 200, and the crew members also between, well, they're usually in the 60s, so it could be 64, 65 as we go through. And you'll always have primary sources with different kind of counts to that. But it was, the impacts of the disaster were far reaching. And as I mentioned, you had approximately anywhere between 130 and 135 passengers, such as, working the upper left-hand corner here, Honorable Elias Dudley Freeman from Yarmouth, Maine, who is returning home after a brief business trip to Boston. He was a 50-year-old attorney who had practiced law in Portland, Maine for many years, was a state senator from Cumberland County and served 2 terms. He was married and had 2 daughters. Next to him, Miss Eunice Augustus Wheeler, traveling with her sister, bound for Portland to attend a relative's funeral. She was from South Weymouth, Massachusetts. Next to them is a family called the Schmidt family. Jess, the husband, Justine, sons Jorgen and Anton, had just returned from Denmark only hours before and decided to board the Portland to speed their return home to Deering, Maine. And then at the bottom is a family. On the left bottom, Charles Thompson, his wife, Susan Thompson, and their daughter, Gladys Thompson. We're all traveling home. And the picture on the right is of Gladys with small obituary that said, Miss Thompson was traveling with her mother and father, Charles Thompson, on board the Portlan. She leaves behind her uncle, Clarence Thompson. Next to them, Miss Dobbs. Miss Dobbs sang in the choir in Portland. And the next day, from a newspaper, December 5th, reads, at First Parish, where Miss Cobb was mentor of the choir, Reverend Mr. Perkins, before his sermon, read a carefully prepared tribute to Miss Cobb and spoke words of sympathy to all who suffered by the disaster. The storm hit Saturday night, and that Sunday she was supposed to perform in the choir. It also should be known that this is 3 days or 2 days after Thanksgiving. So you have untold passengers returning from their holiday or maybe taking extended holiday. The crew as well, their loss had a major impact. Out of the 64 crew members, 25 to 30, again, accounts vary, were African American, and 19 of them were from one congregation reportedly called the Abyssinian House. You see some of the names there. The Abyssinian Meeting House was the heart of the African American community for a number of years in Portland. It was built in 1829 by Reuben Rudy, who was in the area the foremost African American anti-slavery activist and helped form and shape the Underground Railroad in Portland. As I mentioned, it was a social center. It was the first Black congregation in Maine, and currently, as it sits, is currently the third oldest African American meeting house still standing in the United States. There were other African American churches, and the Black community in Portland in 1870 to 1890 was thriving, had their own community along the waterfront where they were providing labor, services, and were often recruited to join the crew of these steamships. As you'll find, was very common after the war in especially these passenger vessels. African-American stewards, stewardesses, cooks, tenders were part of that community, as well as brought in from around the world. The Abyssinian House commemorated the loss through another sermon that was even recorded. And you can see, this was from the newspaper article there. I'm going to read the last few lines from this very powerful kind of testimonial. This is by the Reverend T.A. Smith, and it says at the very end, the indirect allusion of those who perished brought out those nearer to them into tears, and but a few times could be seen with dry eyes. The singing was also effective and well chosen. The close of the sermon was delivered with will sent forth from the living to those noble heroes who perished while in the discharge of their duty. Many leaders of the African community perished on that vessel, and while the Abyssinian House was able to operate for the next few years, it never fully recovered. And so the vessel remained in darkness for almost 100 years. There were searches for it, and the stories and myth grew around it. And then in 1989, two ocean explorers with their own equipment who doggedly set out to discover wrecks around Massachusetts and New England, John Fish and Arnie Carr. John Fish is on the left with his hand on his chin, and Arnie Carr on the right, with the help of a Woods Hole oceanographic named Richard Lineburner, a picture of him on the right, set out to identify the shipwreck. According to historical accounts, well, Arnie and John looked for the vessel, according to historical accounts, without much luck. And so they turned to the oceanographer, Dr. Lineburner, who calculated ocean currents. The bodies that had washed up on the shore for the Portlan, many of them had pocket watches, and they had stopped around 9:30. Of course, It's hard to find analog pocket watches today with digital. But they wouldn't know if it was AM or PM. So he based his calculations on both trajectory and currents for 9:30 PM when it would have sank, or 9:30 AM. Most likely contender was 9:30 AM. And within a few days, few weeks, depending on the story, based on those calculations, Arnie and John had located a vessel that matched the dimensions and the location of the Portlan. Now, I should mention they were doing this all on with side scan sonar. I saw Marty out there, and I want to give Marty Klein a big shout out because side scan sonar has identified and found more shipwrecks than probably any tool out there. Theirs wasn't to a degree that they could get it close enough to the vessel to confirm. So they sat on the information, always intending to go back out there, and had discussions amongst themselves, because in the interim, in 1992, the sanctuary, Stellwagen Bank Sanctuary was established, making a protected area right on their shipwreck. And they weighed on whether or not to provide the locations. Eventually they did to Ben Pascal and his team started to do archaeological research with much kind of big debt to Matt Lawrence and Dee Dee Marks up there. And you see our friendly picture of Vic and Dave Robinson, who I know contributed and helped out. And I always learn little tidbits on how they did. And when I say, oh, this happened, and Vic's like, well, you know. And that's when I learned the real story behind that. So I know they participated and had their own contributions in there as well. And I'm thankful they did, because they made my job much easier. I got to stand on the shoulders of previous research and add to that, hopefully. So as I mentioned, from really 2002 through 2010, 2011, there were several expeditions out to the Portlan with side scan sonar, different types, different kind of advances in technology. In 2004, 2005, there was a photomosaic expedition, a photomosaic, bunch of pictures, you kind of stitch them together to create a virtual site map. And this was the coverage really just at the bow, and you can see the results right here. And it was really good for what they had at the time. And this is the yellow is kind of the footprint of their project in 2004, 2005. We came in 19 and 20 to really try to complete everything else. Of course, this was pretty ambitious, and we were using very different tools. First of all, a lot of times with ROV underwater excavations, you're using a large research vessel of 75 to 100 feet or more, multiple crews, and we were operating off of a vessel that was no longer than 36, it was under 40 feet, the Dawn Treader, right here on your left. And you give you a sense of how big it was. Here's the cabin right there, and there's the captain, there's the helm, there's the the cuddy deck underneath there, and this is where we would have Mike and Evan working, driving the ROV. Here's was a science station. This is Kirsten right there, and looking at our fantastic HD screen, all that, it's that size. You can see there's the scale. And yes, so you're staring underneath there so you can see what they're looking at. And the boat is moving and rocking, and they're adjusting, and seasickness does happen. I should say any picture that right now is from 2019. That's kind of important to remember with COVID. So the closeness in here, no mass, all from 2019, very intimate, very kind of close. And our ROV was not a typical one that would usually require a crane, thousands of pounds. This is our little guy right off the back on just a work table that we were able to launch, and it's called the Rov Pixel. And if you look at the Rov Pixel, he kind of looks, as mentioned earlier, like a Wall-E character. He was designed by Marine Imaging Technology to be just that, to look like a cartoon character that we could create public outreach materials such as Where is Pixel? And to engage younger audiences and to make him a character in our story as well. But don't let that fool you. Inside that little guy is some amazing technology. And it was designed to record HD video and photography to what, as I've been told, the cinema class, that if you wanted to, this could be used at maybe not IMAX, but for movies, documentaries, and operated by a small crew on a small boat for a fraction of the cost that normal ROV projects would cost, but yet still deliver results. And what I'm going to show right now is an example of one of those results. This is a fly through of the Portlan sitting at 500 feet in dark Stellwagen Bank Sanctuary. It's a little fast and things are moving in. That's a capstan. We're coming up the port side. You can see some nets, trawl net. This is the bow with hawse holes coming through. We're skipping over to the starboard. There's lots of gaps. I'll explain that because we're still in the process of post-analysis. We're working our way back to a debris field where you'll see cups, plates, maybe a fish if you know where to look, all at high definition quality. And you can see the scatter as we go through. Now, this is a very raw rendering, but it's designed to show the type of quality that we were able to produce in about 3 or 4 days on the Portlan. As I said, we had other shipwrecks in mind. And 2019, more than anything else, was a learning experience. This is an incomplete model of the walking beam. Portlan had a 30-foot walking beam. It was like a big seesaw that went back and forth, much like a car moving a piston or the axle. It had a kind of connecting rod that connected to the paddle wheels and kept moving. Now, it looks like a bunch of dots and pixels and probably kind of hard to make out here or there, but the walking beam was a diamond shape right at the top, and then the engine connected down below. And you can see a lot of the gaps. As I said, 2019 was a learning experience where we thought we had some solid data. And then as we post-process, and as we zoom in here, you'll see a little white oval shape. This was a pressure gauge where they would read the pressure building up in, that would be the cylinder right there. We'll see this a little bit more. So what I showed you right there was probably almost an ink blot test a little bit, probably wondering what you were seeing. It was very quick. And as we tried to figure out what we needed to improve on in 2020, we used these models as a guide in order to fill in the gaps. But we were able to make some visual qualitative analysis about the cultural impacts, and this did help Stellwagen Bank right off the bat. First one here is a picture in the upper left corner of how the Portlan's bow looked in 2006. You can see life, sponges growing, pretty flourishing along the top of the bow right up here. And then when we came back, all that life is gone. Compare the two, and we see a new net right along here, the trowel net that, as the model showed, came after 2009. We also see some abrasion. Further, these are side scans from 2002 and 2010 of the Portlan. This is a synthetic aperture side scan, really great quality. This is the top of the Portlan, and the shadow shows this beautiful elliptical stern. I love these elliptical sterns. They're so graceful. You see them on, sailing sailboats today, and it's just really a graceful. And we know it was standing proud because of the shadow. If this was on the ground, you wouldn't have that shadow here. It tells you that it was intact. When we came back, we found debris all over the stern, and noticed that that elliptical had been completely sheared off. What you're looking at right here is the rudder, the stern post, and part of the transom framing that, if compared to 2006, should not be visible, should be covered up by this, by the stern. So we know that in that 13-year period or 10-year period, that there had been a major trauma and catastrophe. And while we are putting together, there was several types of fishing gear, nets, lines, and strewn about the various parts of the stern. So right off the bat, we were able to provide Stellwagen with the most up-to-date management, or most up-to-date information for their continued mission of management and preservation of this historical resource. And I would say, might even be estimate that what we covered in 2019, as we learned, working on a small boat, you had different conditions. Working with a small ROV, you were subject to current changes, back and forth, the wiles of the environment. But we did cover a good chunk of the port side and profile, as well as around the stern and looking into the walking beam. But as you saw before, our data just didn't quite match to where we needed it. We were hoping to go back in September on the ROV Connecticut, a full research VIP ship, hopefully more stable, and conduct and fill in those gaps. But we were blown out by the remnants of Hurricane Humberto, which was moved up to the coast. So we focused primarily on one of our goals, which was outreach. And NOAA has this project called Telepresence, where you're basically broadcasting live from the ship. Unfortunately, we weren't live over the site. We were live from the ship, but just in a port. We still connected to almost 10,000 viewers online, including school children from across the United States through 9 different programs. And we were very happy with that. And here's just a picture of our crew in 2019. And so we came back in 2020 with a whole new range of goals and yet a whole new world. Literally, the world had shifted under our feet starting right about now, and nothing was ever kind of the same on how life would be. Especially, we were wondering how we were going to do our research. And so I have another video that kind of introduces our project and talks about the challenges of working and doing underwater research in COVID.
842 square miles, up to 600 feet deep, the final resting place of hundreds of shipwrecks, and one of the top 10 whale-watching destinations in the world. Located 25 miles off Boston, Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary is home to a rich assortment of marine life, including Atlantic cod, haddock, flounder, bluefin tuna, and many species of whales, including the critically endangered North Atlantic right whale. Stellwagen Bank also contains vast numbers of shipwrecks, ranging from wooden sailing ships to modern fishing trawlers. These wrecks are both windows into the past and important habitats for marine life. Stellwagen Bank Sanctuary is one of 16 marine protected areas within the National Marine Sanctuary System, a network of more than 600,000 square miles of underwater parks. Managed by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the sanctuaries promote responsible, sustainable use of ocean and Great Lakes resources. To foster the public's connection with the ocean, NOAA awarded funding to Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, often referred to as WHOI, to conduct state-of-the-art research. Based on nearby Cape Cod, WHOI is the world's oldest and largest nonprofit ocean research and education institution. In 2019, tools and technologies pioneered by WHOI and their partner, Marine Imaging Technologies, let us share high-resolution images and interact with viewers in real time. This year, those same remote tools allow us to carry on our work during the pandemic. In early March, we added innovative microwave technology that beams data to shore, providing faster communication and better images. And we adapted our research model to include a smaller crew at sea and broad distribution to partners on land. COVID-19 has changed many aspects of our lives. But with careful preparation, social distancing, and technology, we can safely continue researching the ocean floor and sharing our discoveries in real time with you.
And so based on that and our experience from 2019, I wager to say we covered almost all parts of the Portland that we could access that were not covered with the nets, especially on the outside. And again, we were going to have a third year of the project to really focus and finish the model, but budget cut that back. So we were looking to complete our virtual model. What you're seeing here is similar to what you saw before from 2019, and part of the bow, as we spin around on the port side, will be added in. This is some of our new data that we've added to it. So you can see we filled in this complete side right now. And what we thought was 3 nets was really 1 trawl net. Let's go back here. Thought I had that. Well, I'm going to show it here again. I skipped over that. I'll come back to that. But here's the completed side of this. And what I was saying was we found that it was really 1 trawl net that had wrapped itself around the bow underneath of it. And the only reason that this part was up in the air is because the floats were still holding it up. And the other part was on this left-hand side. So it really had ensconced the front of the vessel. And in coming with this talk, there's so many amazing and wonderful artifacts I wanted to show, and there's just not enough time to do all this. So I thought I'd do a little tour of the starboard side of Portland, including this little anchor still attached to its chain, tucked underneath the net. We were able to get under that, and the anchor chain, which is right here, still runs up the side of the vessel into the freight or the main deck where it was stowed, and just sits there. And we have all of this wonderful detail that we're going through right now, including here we are at the paddle wheels, and over the paddle wheel was a paddle wheel guard, this gold semicircle that protected the paddle wheels on their, as they moved up and on the return downstroke. Here's a historical photograph. So it was utilitarian purpose, but also aesthetically part of the advertising of the vessel. It was painted gold, and across it was a sponson with the Portland with the name. And so this was part of, and it looks like a globe, and it has that worldly kind of connection to it. So all of this was designed to really advertise the vessel as a palatial, luxurious travel or mode of travel. And we found remnants of that right here. It was designed to let the water out, almost lattice, and it's covered in sediment, but this part is still in the same shape with the little hatches of the lattice framework that was in the design. As well as on the starboard side, the paddle wheels and their flanges still intact. What you see right here are the 3 hubs, or what they're called flanges, of the paddle wheels. You have the outer, the inner, the middle, and the inner still on the paddle shaft, still connected all the way back to the walking beam and the crankshaft in their original positions, with the spokes that would have connected them to the rims and then the paddles as well. And on the outside, so this is a profile view of the outside of the outer paddle wheel. It's still standing there. We have remnants of the rim that surrounded it, as well as the spokes that connected, and it's still in situ, connected to its paddle shaft. Very amazing. We were able to get into the walking beam with the knowledge that we learned, walking beam area with the knowledge that we learned from 2019, and produce a much more complete scale. This is a photo mosaic. This is 30 feet tall from bottom up to the top of the A-frame right here, and thousands of videos created. And what's wonderful is that if you compare it to an illustration from steam engine, Bible of the day, you can see places still there. If we go down, we can see the walking beam, A-frame, piston. This is the upper chamber for that the high pressure gas would be let into, kind of creating the dual reciprocating motion. Here is the cylinder, 62-inch diameter cylinder for the 12-foot piston stroke coming down. As the gas came in here, it would push it down. Here's a lower chamber. You push it up, and you would create this up and down motion connected. We have a gap right here to the walking beam, and this would be the seesaw. It would transfer the motion back to the connecting rod, which does exist, all the way down to the crankshaft and crank arms, and this would be at the paddle wheel, or excuse me, the paddle shaft that would be connected to the paddle wheels. You even have the plumbing, as I like to call it, the condenser and the air pump back in here that you can see. So for steam enthusiasts and steam engines enthusiasts, this sits 500 feet below the water, complete darkness. And for the first time, we're able to really examine it and to take a look at and test some hypotheses of what could have sank it if some of the engines were broken apart. Additionally, some very intimate parts. You can't really see what's circled there, but it says the washroom. And right next to it is a toilet. And then right next to the toilet, you can have a sink with holes for the basins, which are 1, 2. And so you could wash your hands right here. And then the diagnostic feature is a large beam that was about 12 inches by 14 inches. And I put it right here. This was called the Aft Wheel Beam. And I'm going to come back to it because this really, if you're looking for, if this is a puzzle piece, this was a keystone, something that locked in the outside of the vessel, debris out here, to some very, for me, very important artifacts on the inside. So the puzzle pieces are coming together, but until we have that full model, it's all relative, and we don't have scale. We don't have a full archaeological quantitative context yet that we're hoping to do, but it still gives us more information than has ever been recorded before. There was a video right there, but for the sake of time, it introduces our second goal of the Portlan, which was actually to look inside and check out the engines. What you see here is Pixel carrying its own ROV that we originally called PPE, Portlan Penetrator Explorer, PPE for COVID, and the acronym was, acronym of the year. And you can see Pixel, which is, not very big itself, able to carry PPE, which became later nicknamed Taz, down into onto the Portlan. We had reconnaissance appropriate places to deploy this that would not affect the site or harm the site. There were lots of openings into the interior of Portlan. And what I'd like to share right now is some raw video of actually entering into the below decks, below the main deck, going down into the engine. It's a lot of sediment, a lot of timber, and I'll kind of talk about what we see as we go through some of the material and artifacts. I hope maybe somebody out there will have idea, but this is actual footage that's been cut down of our first reconnaissance into the Portlan. And you can see right here, Taz or PPE is looking back at Pixel. We're now entering into the engine area. And what we were trying to do is move forward from the walking beam and look towards the boilers and the coal bunkers and explore that way. But the sediment, as one might expect, is pretty much close to the ceiling. We do see pipes, intakes, curving up around valves all over the place. We're now looking at the bottom of the engine, down at the very, where this would be the air pump and surface condenser is. You can see a valve right there, some type of lattice metal work. I thought originally it might be from the Salon decks, but we're not sure. A valve. Some more piping attached to the around the A-frame. And what looks like a lamp with a beautiful kind of sconce sitting right there. It's very haunting. Brass plate. And here we are at the top of the boilers. We were able to actually get to the side of the boiler, but not around to it, onto the front side, but we actually made it to the boilers. And identified originally as maybe part of a leather shoe, although unknown right now. And so quite a bit was going on, including our outreach had to be moved from the boat. We couldn't go and do our normal outreach. We did it from the sanctuary headquarters on the dock, where everybody had a special corner. If you were inside, you had to wear a mask. We still were able to do 6 programs and reach over 27,000 people this time, which was about 3 times more than we were in 2019. So our engagement and outreach was very effective. We were very proud of being able to do that with COVID. And one question I got asked a lot of the times was, what was your favorite part of, or was one of the favorite things you saw in the Portlan? And I'd have to say, it is these artifacts. You can take a look, you see plates. Right here is a warming tray, various warming trays and plates all along here. And if you look right here, you'll see a beam. And this is that same beam that I had mentioned before, the support beam, and it runs down to the toilet and the glass and the mirrors for the washroom. And so we were able to locate this warming tray right outside, or would be right in this area. And right behind it is the ladies' salon. And for me, this was very intimate, very powerful, because while there's no documentation that there was segregation between women and men on board the ship, there was an area where women could go and be by themselves, or where you would have Miss Cobb talk with Susan and maybe Gladys, where Mrs. Schmidt, Justine could go and talk to Eunice, possibly. And you'd have a mixture right here, and they would be helped by Carrie Harris, who was an African-American stewardess who had been working for a number of years on the Portlan. And what it really speaks to me is that the Portlan isn't a shipwreck. I'm working a lot with Heritage and Living Memory to put the nature of this disaster in more of a context, as opposed to just sitting 500 feet. And I normally don't do this. I usually don't read, but I think for the frameworks that I've been working with, I'm just going to read what I've put together as we were trying to look for funding. That Portlan is a night boat and is a representation of industry and class. And so at the end of the 19th century, ships were the primary tools of globalization. While railroads provided competition for inland travel, seafaring was still the only means to bring goods and people to different continents and countries. Ships were cultural carriers and vectors for economic exchange and trade. And during the Gilded Age, new social classes developed that were precursors to today's middle, business, and tourism classes. These societal groups had disposable income that could afford to travel more luxuriously. This demand for comfortable travel, combined with increased efficiency and reliable steam connectivity, created a thriving industry and clientele for passenger ships. The night boats themselves were places where members of different social classes occupied the same spaces temporarily. Thus, night boats became places of interaction and information exchange between different socioeconomic classes, contained with a highly mobile but confined space. Similar in principle, but not designed to today's mobile technology, which allows information exchange among diverse demographics using the confined platforms of computers, smartphones, or personal tablets. Once passengers were on board, the crew worked to ensure the overnight trips were as comfortable as possible. In essence, these ships were mobile hotels with recreational spaces and places where work was hidden, and the crew, whether they were tasked with serving paying clientele or keeping the ship afloat and moving, were trained to keep the work they performed hidden or minimally obtrusive, Similar to today's COVID-19 pandemic, these essential workers would be the first passengers looked to as the veil between luxury and labor broke down during a tragedy. When ships broke down, passengers started noticing the hidden work and the workers they had previously taken for granted. For example, as the Portlan struggled in the storm, everyone relied on the hidden work of the engines and the boilers to keep the ship afloat, and for those essential workers above the engines to provide comfort in the face of immediate peril. Suddenly, they were not hidden, and their value was obvious. And we find parallels in today with essential workers. Additionally, shipwrecks become wounded places in memory spaces. This is where trauma fills both the physical and cognitive spaces of memory. The physical wounds exist in the space of the archaeological site, where the ship has fallen, broken apart, scattered its artifacts, and now rests on the seafloor as a testament to failed tragedy. There is also the physical space of water, both on the surface and below. The tragedy of a shipwreck always begins at the water surface in discrete time and place, but as it slips below the waves, evidence of trauma can be washed away in the dynamic ocean environment. The waves hide the tragedy, but the evidence still exists when the ship lands on the sea floor, occupying a space and creating a place of commemoration. Unlike wounded places and sites of trauma that are commemorated on land, such as Gettysburg or the 9/11 monument, most people cannot visit shipwrecks due to the physical boundary of the ocean. That separation sparks our innate curiosity and draws us to the wreck site with questions about how and why it sank, what has happened to it since its sinking, what remains, and most importantly, what became of all the lives lost. These types of questions speak to the space that shipwrecks symbolically hold in our memory, but they are not academic questions. They are the most important, impactful, and essential questions for the immediate family, friends, associates of those lost. Then they become sustaining questions that cross generations and bind communities and people through time to the present and into the future. Sadly, these questions sometimes go unanswered, so the cognitive wounds that are held in the space of memory are never healed. And I say that because I have the opportunity, as I mentioned at the beginning, to go and interview descendants, some of the victims, and find out just the space and place that the wrecking of the Portlan holds for them personally. And our first interview I'd like to just share, and we're almost at the end, is from Fran Silcock, who is the granddaughter of one of the victims, passenger George H. Cole, who was a flour merchant. He sold flour, not flowers, imported, taken from Portlan, sold in Boston, and come back with other goods. Her grandmother was his widow. So I'm hoping the video will play.
Was only 2 years old when her grandfather was drowned. And my grandmother, so she never knew him, and of course I never knew him. My grandmother found it difficult to talk about it. It was not talked about a lot, but occasionally we would, if I was be alone with her often, and I would ask her something, tell me, Nana, about the Portland. She would tell me a few things, and she did not know a lot either because of the communication at that time. They didn't know for several days whether the ship was lost or was just off course or what. And during that time, my grandmother would go when she could. She was living in Portland at the time with my family. She would go down to the wharfs where people were gathering, people who were on the Portland, to try to get some information. And the foghorns blew incessantly. And as a result, even many years later, when I was growing up, she couldn't stand to hear the foghorns because they were to her the horns of death. If anything, I would like to find my cousin someday when I have time and see if she still has Nana's trunk. I'd like to get in that trunk. We were never allowed to touch it. Once in a while, my grandmother would open it. Yeah, she would open it.
Did she ever show anybody? Did she?
She would take out the paper,
Oh,
the newspaper, yes. And the last I knew, that was still in there. There were other things in there that belonged to her. I don't know if they pertain to the Portland or not. I don't remember what was in there.
Did anybody ever get in trouble for going too close to Nana's trunk? As kids sometimes do.
No,
That was
no.
Making sure everybody knew to stay away from
That was Nana's trunk, and you didn't touch it.
That's very good. That's very...
She would be very, I don't know the best term, perhaps wistful, sad somewhat. But then she would get over it very quickly. She would explain to us a little bit about it, about the sinking, and then put the paper back in the trunk, and that was it. Say, we're going to have dinner in half an hour.
Also had an opportunity to visit with a few others, including Bob Green on the right, who is the great-grandson of the widow of Eben Houston, who was a second steward aboard the Portland. Originally, it was reported that Eben and his wife had both perished, but that was untrue. Bob's great-grandmother was on shore in Portland. And the tragedy was that they were about to celebrate their first-year wedding anniversary, which they had been married December 25th, 1897. And so had just been married and were not able to celebrate that. Bob has quite a connection to Portland. He's holding up a picture of another ancestor, William Wilberforce Ruby, who's credited with alerting people to the Great Fire of 1866. The fire of 1866 was in Portland, Maine, and up until that point was the greatest urban fire that America had experienced. The Chicago fire was not till 1871. There were over 1,800 buildings were burnt, as it started on July 4th through a firecracker accident and swept up the hill, leaving 10,000 homeless. And it is one of the reasons, as I learned from Bob, that Portland symbol is the phoenix rising from the ashes. And in fact, he had a ring commemorating that. And what I noticed one time on the Portland model, and unfortunately I don't have a good picture right here, was a symbol. And I looked at it closer and closer, and it looked pretty abstract. It kind of looked like a flattened bird with three tails. And then it had a phrase, which I thought was resurgans. And as I mentioned, I used to teach Latin, and I knew that would mean to rise up or to arise. And so with a little bit of investigation, I found, well, let me provide one more. You can see the motto actually on the historical photograph, not in detail, but right there, you can see it standing up a little bit. And so I looked into it after talking to Bob, and sure enough, Portland's heritage and living memory, or Surgam, it is the official motto, meaning I arise from the ashes of the 1866 fire. They've had a couple other fires too. And when I pulled up the seal, it looked to me like a seagull with two floppy fish. And I thought, well, that's not a phoenix. So I actually looked it up, and I copied the description right here so you would believe me, because if I said that looked like a phoenix, maybe you would think I was wrong. But actually the seal contains a shield bearing a ship supported by two dolphins. Oh, by the way, those are dolphins. The shield is set on top of an anchor and a bird, which is supposed to represent the phoenix. And to me, this brought everything back, everything connected, that what we were really doing was living that motto. We were bringing the ship up virtually through these 3D models, both for archaeological and biological analysis, but more importantly, to reconnect it from 500 feet in the depths to the city which it's named after, and to connect that part of history, to rise up from the depths as the city of Portland has risen up from the ashes, as the Abyssinian house continues to fight and rise up from neglect and disuse since it closed its doors around 1920, and to really tell the story that goes beyond the archaeology, that connects to the heritage, that brings it back to the living memory. And I think that is really the power of archaeology. I really think that is the power of understanding how shipwrecks, as Vic noted, aren't about the ships themselves. That at the end of the day, our goal as archaeologists, as historians, as anthropologists, is to always remember the human element and to always put that in focus of any of our studies. Because if the site map doesn't come through, if the funding doesn't work, where we can't complete the 3D model to where I know it can be, at the end of the day, we still can make those connections and still have impact. And the purpose of going out there won't be in vain. It won't just sit on the shelf. It'll make a difference. So thank you for staying around with me. I appreciate all of that. And that brings me to the end of my talk.
Well, thank you, Calvin. That was excellent. I learned so much. So if people have questions for Calvin, you can put them in the chat for me, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. So just send them along and I'll relay them. I am happy, Calvin, that you did mention Pixel. When I ever saw that, I was just like, oh my God, it looks like, you know, Wally. And he's like, actually, that was very purposeful. Bill W says, excellent, thank you. So
Thank you, Bill.
Definitely getting kudos. I will start with a question I've asked every other speaker we have had, which is, how did you get into maritime archaeology? Especially now that Vic's like, you did classics, you did all this, like, you know, how'd you get into that?
Yeah, a long and windy road. I actually have a full other lecture called Career in Making Bad Life Choices. What
is it? A wetsuit looks very slimming and nice, right?
Well, not necessarily on me. A scuba diver in equipment is the most ungainly creature in the world, even in water.
I own my own, and it's like, oh.
Yeah. Well, it gets even weirder because, you know, I got my undergraduate out of University of Montana, a state known for its coastline and maritime traditions, and sometimes considered Canada by people who haven't gotten that far west. And how it happened is I just wanted to travel. I took a trip over to Rome, fell in love with the classics, Latin, Greek, got me out of Montana, got me to travel more. I learned how to scuba dive in a quarry in Pennsylvania and in Montana, which I recommend because it means everything else is so much better. And I took a volunteer job in Israel at an underwater site called Caesarea, which was built by King Herod in 1st century BC. Didn't know what I was doing. And at the end of the project, I didn't care because I loved it. I mean, I was just like, wow. And I saw people who were doing it and I thought I'd like to be them and try to figure that out. And I call it career and life choices because you can imagine your parents sitting in Montana saying, hey, Dad, Mom, I'm going to major in Latin. And they're like, oh, good choice. A lot of good opportunities in that and making that work. And then saying, you know what, I'm going to give up the lucrative career of classics to go into the fantastic growing of maritime archaeology. And God bless them, they were supportive and we made it work because it's really, I have taken a very much a holistic approach to this field as opposed to being defined by a certain period or geography. And my background's education. I love to teach. I love to work with students of all ages, and that kind of makes it adaptable. You know, I'm at a point too where I'm really itching to complete some of these projects, not like, oh, we have all this great data. So, but life moves forward.
Well, thank you. And that actually goes to Dave Robinson's comment to you, which is, thank you, Calvin, for putting some humanity back into the humanities. So you definitely do make it about the people and not about the ship per se.
Well,
we have a question from Cynthia. Where did the blueprints of the ship come from?
Well, so those blueprints in part were a little bit of archaeological research through NOAA and probably some combinations of other passenger vessels. Now, Bluefields was a model company designed hired specifically to create the model for the Discovery Channel documentary back in 2003. And where there's, a budget, there's a way. So as far as the actual initial blueprints of Portland, I have not been able to find the primary sources, but these types of ships were industrial standards too. They have Portland has a sister ship called the Bay State. And then later on, as Vic mentioned, we're looking at the city of Rockland. So for the most, and also based on the description. So it's kind of a conglomeration where they built that model out.
Okay. We have another question. Did the boat also transport cargo in addition to people?
Yes, actually, it had a lot of wares, including some flour. As Cole, a gentleman here, that's why I have it written down. George Cole was a flour merchant, and so we haven't found any of the cargo on board, in part because of this. Most of the superstructure was ripped apart, exposing the freight deck. But it had a cargo freight deck that you could, again, businesses, imports, exports, did a little bit of everything.
Okay. Another question is about how many descendants have you been able to talk with?
Well, we know of a half a dozen, and I've probably talked to, I'm looking at my list right now, 4 of them. There's, they're octogenarians, and one I've been trying to get a hold of a few times, and her sister, but she's 87 and just luck hasn't held out. So we have a couple other leads of people around Boston, and these have all been really graciously kind of offered through a gentleman up in Portland I mentioned briefly. His name's Herb Adams, and he's the local historian and really has made Portland a work of passion. And every year he goes and commemorates on November 27th with ringing of the bells, the loss of the Portland, and really has been a wonderful resource.
What has the family members' reaction been when you sort of popped up into their radar and been like, hi?
Well, I have, again, giving credit to Herb, he it's not a cold call. He's able to introduce it. They trust him, they know him, and we've been talking back and forth about going up there. So they're well prepared for what we were trying to do, and they're very, they're reticent to start with. It's one of these, you don't know what to say, and just keep them talking. And these stories like with Fran, that was at the end of the interview because she was fun. It's hard to open up about family members, and yet when you do, you really see just how much it means to them. And that story about the Nana's, her chest and going into it is even, she goes into it a little bit more than we could talk about.
Very interesting. So we have final 2 questions, but they're basically the same. Is the wreck site marked so that further damage by trawls can be avoided, or are there any future plans to protect it?
That is an excellent question, and exactly one of the consequences of our project, even in 2019. Now, NOAA's policy is always non-disclosure. That's their default policy. But part of that too is, with the fishing activity, their accidents happen. And what they're based on this project, they are reconsidering that default policy through a program they're still talking about called the Shipwreck Avoidance Program. And it's ongoing, but really seeing the consequences of those really just less than a decade impacts upon the Portland has inspired or jumped that as a priority right at the top of the list, where before I don't think headquarters or NOAA headquarters would have been paying much attention. So to answer the question is, there's nothing concrete right now outside of what they already have, but they're ongoing immediate discussions about how they preserve their wrecks, not just at Portland, but other sites within the sanctuary as well. So it's really kind of ignited that discussion, and I think some changes in their policy will be happening in the near term, within a year or two, at least in a couple of years.
Okay, great to hear. And we have Claudia and Laurel both saying thank you, Calvin, for a very interesting lecture with some great photos and things. So yes, kudos to you, Dr. Mires, Calvin. I know you too well now, so I'm not, no titles there. So thank you for sharing this wonderful research with us. This was so engaging, so much fun to listen to on a Tuesday night. For our viewers, for our members, please join us next month. We will be joined by Julie Dana, who will be talking about her work with the Veterans Curation Program, which is a really exciting program. And with that, we will let everyone go. So thank you so much. Yay. And this will be uploaded to the MAS YouTube page. So if you have any friends or family who have missed it, or you want to look back at Calvin's lecture, you can do that. So thank you guys. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you, Calvin.
Thanks, Vic.